The Ferris family from Cherokee County, Georgia, seemed to be the epitome of the ideal for many years. Gary and Melody Farris have found the harmony that many people strive for: love, respect, financial stability. Their lives were an exemplary model of well-being, which others regarded with admiration and even envy. It seemed that they had everything: a strong marriage, a successful career, a cozy home, and a wonderful child. However, behind the immaculate facade, there was something more, something that outsiders did not notice. Their meeting took place in Atlanta, at one of the charity events. Gary, a young and ambitious lawyer, stood out among those present with a confident manner of communication and a keen sense of justice. He had the charisma of a man who was used to getting his way. Melody, sophisticated and elegant, attracted attention not only with her beauty, but also with the insight with which she assessed others. Their first acquaintance quickly turned into interest, and then into deep feelings. The wedding was a logical continuation of their story. They believed that they had found the perfect partners in each other. Their smiles in the wedding photos reflected sincere joy filled with dreams of the future. The life they started building together seemed reliable, stable, and flawless. After moving to Atlanta, they set up a house in which everything obeyed harmony and order. Family traditions created an atmosphere of stability, and the birth of their son, Scott, further strengthened their union. Gary, who always believed that a father should be an example of strength and hard work, tried to pass on to his son the principles that he considered inviolable. He paid attention to his upbringing, striving to make him a person who could achieve anything he wanted. In the eyes of others, the Ferrises were an exemplary family, friendly, open-minded, and always ready to help. They have become part of the local community, actively participating in charitable and social initiatives. Their house was a place where friends and acquaintances often gathered, and the annual farm parties had become a good tradition, expected by many. Gary has had a brilliant career. In Atlanta's legal circles, his name was synonymous with success. He was known as an analyst and a strategic professional who was able to win even the most difficult cases. He aspired to victory in everything he did, and rarely put up with defeats. His efficiency, intelligence, and perseverance allowed him to remain among the best. Over time, his influence in the professional sphere only grew. He signed major contracts, expanded his network of contacts, and strengthened his reputation. His status allowed the family to lead a comfortable lifestyle without needing anything. However, Gary himself did not always find satisfaction in his career achievements. The higher he climbed, the more often he felt inner tension, which he tried to hide. Away from the hustle and bustle of Atlanta, the family had a place to escape from city life. The farm in Alpharetta became a second home for them, a source of peace and solitude. The spacious fields, the warm comfort of the wooden house, and the measured rhythm of rural life gave Gary the opportunity to feel free. He found satisfaction in simple tasks. He tended the garden, repaired fences, and walked around the territory. For him, the farm became a place where he could briefly forget about negotiations, court sessions, and the constant struggle for success. He wasn't a lawyer here, he just lived. Melody also appreciated this place at first, but over time her attitude changed. Where her husband found peace, she saw monotony. The farm, which had become a refuge for him, had become a symbol of routine for her, which lacked the lightness and energy she was used to. The couple continued to give the impression of an ideal couple. Their family remained an example of stability, success, and respect. Outwardly, nothing betrayed that tension was growing inside them. Over time, an invisible distance appeared between them. Gary became more and more career-focused, spending less time at home, and his mind was on work and ambitious projects. Melody, on the other hand, felt more and more lonely. Their conversations were getting shorter, and their silences were getting longer. They maintained an outward picture of well-being, but realized that this picture was gradually losing its meaning. Neighbors, friends, acquaintances, no one noticed the changes. For them, Gary and Melody remained the perfect couple. However, each house has its own truth, and their truth gradually ceased to conform to the image they so carefully maintained. The cracks, barely noticeable at first, gradually became deeper. Their life together no longer brought the same satisfaction. The evenings they once spent together became filled with silence. The tension grew, but neither of them dared to admit that their ideal world was no longer as solid as before. Gary saw that his wife was moving away, but he perceived it as a temporary difficulty that would pass over time. He was sure that everything could be fixed, that you just need to be patient, show patience and endurance. For him, there were no concepts of failure or defeat, and the crisis in the family seemed to be just another problem that needed to be solved. Melody felt like she was losing herself. For her, their home, farm, and life together became something that no longer brought joy. She began to wonder if she was really happy, or if she was just playing the role expected of her by society. They continued to pretend that everything was fine, but one day the moment came when it became impossible to pretend, and then their world began to crumble. July 2018 will forever remain in the memory of the residents of Alpharetta, Georgia, as the time when one of the most respected families faced an inexplicable tragedy. The Ferris family farm, once filled with life and warmth, suddenly turned into an epicenter of horror. Scott Ferris, the son of renowned attorney Gary Ferris, could never have imagined that a routine visit to a farm would lead him to a shocking discovery that would change everything. On that fateful day, he was confronted with a horror that was forever etched into his mind. This was the beginning of a high-profile investigation that shocked the entire Cherokee County. Gary Ferris was a man of strict principles. Being an experienced lawyer, he is used to a strict schedule, discipline, and punctuality. His clients and colleagues knew that if Gary gave his word, he would keep it. If there's an appointment, he'll be there. But that day, everything didn't go according to plan. When Gary didn't show up for an important meeting, his colleagues became worried. The first attempts to reach him were unsuccessful. The lawyer's phone was disconnected, something completely out of character for him. He didn't answer any calls or texts. This caused alarm among his entourage, and soon his son, Scott Ferris, began receiving calls from his father's acquaintances. People were wondering if everything was okay, because Gary had never disappeared without warning before. Scott knew his father wasn't the type to disappear without explanation. He was sure that something serious was going to happen. One single thought stuck in his mind: to check out the farm. The trip to the farm passed in anxious silence. The closer Scott got to the family home, the more anxious he became. The Ferris farm has always been full of life. The sound of birds, the sounds of working equipment, sometimes laughter, or the voice of his father talking on the phone. But that day, an oppressive silence enveloped her. No one came out to meet him, and his father's usual greeting was not heard. Scott stopped the car in front of the house, turned off the engine, and listened. Silence. When he reached the porch, he pushed open the door. It was unlocked. As soon as he entered, he felt that something was wrong. There was a cup of cold coffee in the kitchen, and scattered documents on the table next to it. It was as if Gary had only paused for a moment to do something else. But he was nowhere to be found. Scott walked through the rooms, calling for his father, but there was no answer. There wasn't a single clue in the house where he might have gone. After inspecting the house, Scott headed to the courtyard. The only place my father could have been was in the outbuildings. Scott knew that his father often visited the barns. He could fix equipment, do repairs, just relax from the hustle and bustle of the city. As he approached the barns, he called out to his father, but in response he heard only the echo of his footsteps. The excitement inside him grew. He slowly pulled open the door of one of the sheds and immediately felt the pungent smell of burning. It was a strange, heavy smell that instantly stung my nose. When he walked inside, something caught his eye that took his breath away. In the center of the room, a body lay on the floor, charred by the flames. It took him a moment to realize what he was seeing, but then reality hit him with incredible force. It was his father. Scott froze. My thoughts were racing erratically. Was it an accident, or was there something much more sinister behind it? With trembling hands, he covered his mouth, stifling a scream. Everything was turning inside out. The barn that used to be his father's place of work and recreation has now become the scene of a nightmare. Scott took a step back, breathing heavily. He needed to call the police, but his fingers were shaking so much that he could barely hold the phone. "This is my father. I found him. He's dead," he croaked into the phone. "The Ferris farm, Alpharetta, the barn." The dispatcher tried to calm him down by asking questions about the location and condition of the body. But Scott's mind was clouded. This call was the first step in a chain of events that were supposed to reveal the sinister truth. After the bell rang, Scott remained standing near the barn, afraid to even look inside. the terrible vision cannot be erased from memory. There was only one question in his head: what had happened to his father? He knew that there were many months of investigation ahead, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. After Scott Ferris's alarm call to the emergency services, the Cherokee County Police promptly arrived at the scene. The Ferris family farm in Alpharetta immediately attracted the attention of not only patrolmen, but also criminologists who had to figure out the circumstances of this mysterious death. Medical experts arrived with them, ready for an initial assessment of the body's condition. For local officers, this was standard protocol. A person's death, especially in such circumstances, was always considered potentially suspicious. However, even at first glance, the tragedy of Gary Ferris promised to be a difficult matter. The police began their inspection from the main house, moving on to the adjacent buildings. They examined every detail, paying attention to any anomalies. Scott, overcome with grief, showed them the way to the barn, but did not dare to go inside himself. The barn where the body was found looked well maintained but old. It was a simple wooden building where Gary often spent time doing repairs or just relaxing from the hustle and bustle of the city. When the officers entered the building, they were immediately alerted by the persistent smell of burning that still filled the air. Charred boards and soot marks on the floor indicated a small fire that had clearly not spread throughout the room. Burnt fragments of material lay around the body, as if confirming that the fire had been extinguished by someone. Gary's body was on the floor, in a position that seemed strange to the investigators. The officers drew attention to the fact that the fire seemed to have gone out either by itself or had also been stopped by someone. Criminologists photographed the scene and recorded the position of the body. They carefully examined his condition, but at this stage they found no obvious signs of violent death. At first glance, death could have been the result of an accident, smoke inhalation, or fainting from toxic fumes. However, the strange position of the body and partially burned clothes made one wonder. After examining the body, the police's attention turned to the barn itself. They checked every detail: the condition of the wiring, the presence of ignition sources, traces of possible use of combustible materials. The remains of burnt-out items that could have belonged to Gary were found at the site. However, none of the items indicated an obvious cause of the fire. The electrical wiring did not look damaged, and there were no tools nearby that could cause a spark. Special attention was paid to the barn doors and windows. The police were looking for signs of forced entry, but nothing like this was found. Based on the data collected, the officers came to a preliminary conclusion. The tragedy could have been caused by an accidental fire. Perhaps Gary was doing something and lost consciousness from the smoke. At first glance, this seemed like a logical explanation, as there were no signs of a struggle or violent actions at the scene. However, final conclusions could only be drawn after conducting a forensic medical examination. Gary's body was transferred to the laboratory for further examination. Scott Ferris, watching the work of the police, could not get rid of the feeling that something was missing. He told the officers that his father had always been extremely careful. He never used combustible materials in the barn and strictly observed safety regulations. These words forced the police to pay attention to additional details, but so far, they have not changed the original version. As Gary's body was loaded onto a transport, the police continued to collect evidence. The criminologists took soot samples and fragments of burnt materials, photographed all the key elements of the shed, and carefully documented their actions. The autopsy was supposed to be a crucial moment. It depended on his results whether this case would be treated as an accident or whether the investigation would take a new, more disturbing turn. After several hours of work, the police completed the initial inspection. Part of the territory has been cordoned off for further investigation, so that criminologists can return if necessary. The family was informed that the results of the examination will be ready in the near future. However, for Scott, the time up to this point dragged on endlessly. He had the feeling that what had happened was not just a tragic accident. He hoped that the autopsy would reveal the truth. After all, even in the silence of the farm, now enveloping everything around, there was something sinister. After the transfer of Gary Ferris's body to the forensic experts, the investigation gradually began to change direction. The initial version of the accident, which seemed the most logical, turned out to be in doubt when the police received the first autopsy results. The key task now is to study the deceased's environment. his family, friends, financial situation, and possible conflicts. The detectives understood that there could be more to this case than just an accident, and the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the picture became. One of the first steps of the investigation was a detailed interview of Gary's neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances. The police wanted to reconstruct his last days and find out if he had any enemies. Most of the neighbors were extremely positive about Gary. He was known as a man of his word, a professional who adhered to strict moral principles. He was loved by his clients, respected by his colleagues, and at first glance, there was not a single person who could wish him harm. But during the conversations, details surfaced that made the detectives wary. At first glance, the Ferris family remained a model of stability, but cracks had long since begun to appear in the house that seemed to be a fortress. Neighbors who lived near their farmhouse admitted that not everything was as smooth as it might seem from the outside. Sometimes fragments of tense conversations penetrated through the walls, rare but loud outbursts of emotion. Gary has always been a man used to controlling situations, but behind the exterior facade of confidence was a man who was getting tougher every year. If their house had been filled with warmth before, now it was increasingly becoming an arena of silent confrontation. Melody, who had previously been balanced and calm, had been increasingly irritated in recent months. Her voice became sharper, her movements more nervous. She tried to hide her displeasure, but it seeped into the details. In quick, short answers, in a distant look, in avoiding long conversations. Those who knew them intimately noted that there was a tension between the spouses that could not be overlooked. The police also found out that financial issues could become one of the main causes of conflicts. Gary, being a lawyer, tightly controlled the family's budget, independently making key decisions related to money. For him, order in everything, including finances, was a matter of principle. Melody eventually began to feel that she was being deprived of financial freedom. She complained to friends that she had to justify herself for every major purchase, and the need to constantly coordinate expenses led to increasing irritation. Financial disputes became a part of their daily lives. Talking about money no longer sounded like discussions, but more like accusations. During the investigation, several family acquaintances started talking about possible treason. Although no one could say for sure, rumors were spreading. One of the neighbors reported seeing Melody with a man he had never met before. Their conversation was lively but intense, and there was more than just a friendly conversation in their interaction. The investigators understood that if Melody really had someone else, it could be a motive for the crime. So far, it was just a guess, but the very possibility of betrayal added a new shade to the picture of events. When the medical examiners completed the analysis of Gary's body, the initial assumptions about death as a result of the fire turned out to be erroneous. The cause of death was a gunshot wound. The bullet lodged in his ribs was fired from a small caliber pistol. This immediately ruled out the possibility of an accident. The fire that engulfed the farmhouse was not the cause of death, but only a means to conceal the crime. Someone was trying to destroy the tracks, to cover up the evidence, to make Gary's death look like a tragic accident. With the evidence obtained, the police officially reclassified the case as murder. Now the investigators faced the task of finding out who could be behind the crime and what was the motive. The main focus of the investigation shifted to the victim's inner circle. Melody Farris came under suspicion. Melody's behavior from the first days after the tragedy raised some questions. She didn't show much emotion, which usually accompanies the loss of a loved one. There was no hysteria, despair, or even anger in her voice. She did not ask questions, was not interested in the progress of the investigation, did not demand to find the culprit. During the first interrogation, Melody claimed that she did not know where her husband was on the day of his disappearance. However, the witnesses said otherwise. Neighbors saw her at the farm this morning, although she claimed to have spent the whole day at home. When she was asked to describe her actions that day in detail, there was confusion in her words, and the details began to contradict each other. Now the investigators needed to find out the possible motives of Melody's crime. One of the first was the financial motive. According to relatives, Gary controlled all the money in the family, and this could cause Melody irritation and a desire to change the situation. Then a personal motive was considered. That is, if rumors of cheating had reached Gary, it could have led to a conflict that ended in tragedy. And finally, the arson of the house clearly indicated an intention to cover their tracks. The decisive turn in the investigation occurred after the family's bank check. It turned out that Melody was the sole beneficiary of Gary's $2 million insurance policy. This fact changed everything. It was no longer just a family drama. Now it looked like a carefully planned crime. The insurance Gary took out during his lifetime could be the key to financial freedom for his wife. When she was informed of this discovery during the interrogation, her reaction changed. The tension in her voice, the sudden restraint in her responses, indicated that she realized the seriousness of the situation. As the investigation progressed, investigators noticed that Melody's testimony began to change. At first, she claimed that she had not left the house, then admitted that she had been to the farm, but did not specify why. Even more suspicious was the fact that her phone was turned off for several hours on the day of the tragedy. She could not give a clear explanation of where she was at that time. All these inconsistencies formed a single picture. The police knew Melody was hiding something. Now, everything pointed to the fact that Gary Ferris' death was not an accident. The investigators continued to collect evidence, build a chronology of events, and analyze Melody's behavior. But the main question remained open. Did she really commit murder for the sake of money? Or was there something more behind it? Each new detail brought them closer to the solution, but the final answer remained ahead.
Detectives say she tried to hide the alleged shooting by burning his body afterwards.
After the end of the interrogation, the police had little doubt that Melody Farris was directly involved in her husband's death. The financial motive, inconsistencies in testimony, and suspicious behavior all added up to a convincing picture of her guilt. Despite the convincing evidence gathered, the investigation still had one serious problem. The gun used to shoot Gary Ferris has never been found. This circumstance created certain difficulties, but it did not negate the main conclusion. His death was not an accident. The forensic medical examination clearly established that the cause of death was a gunshot wound, and the fire was only a way to conceal the traces of a crime. After several weeks of investigation, financial analysis, witness interviews, and consultations with the prosecutor's office, the Cherokee County Police made the final decision. Melody Farris's arrest was inevitable. The investigation concluded that there were practically no alternative versions left. Financial motives, inconsistencies in her testimony, lack of a convincing alibi, and suspicious restraint in her behavior made her the main suspect. The question now was not whether she was guilty, but whether the investigators would be able to bring the case to an end without direct evidence, the murder weapon. The decision to arrest was made with extreme caution. The Ferrises were a respected family in Alpharetta, and an accusation of murdering the head of the family could cause a wide public outcry. However, justice could not depend on public opinion. The collected materials gave the investigation every right to act. The operation was planned to eliminate the possibility of escape and minimize media attention. Before dawn, several patrol cars arrived at the Ferris farm. The officers quietly surrounded the house, checking all possible escape routes before knocking on the door. Melody opened it almost immediately. She was in her home clothes, with no signs of hasty packing or trying to escape. There was no surprise on her face, as if she had known in advance that this moment was inevitable. When the arrest warrant was read to her, she did not try to justify herself, did not ask questions, did not require a lawyer. She only glanced briefly at the officers and calmly allowed herself to be handcuffed. The arrest took place without incident, but left a lot of questions. Those who watched this moment expected to see panic, tears, and protests. But none of this happened. There was not even an attempt to deny the accusations. After being detained, Melody was taken to the county jail. A court hearing was soon held on her possible release on bail. However, the judge rejected the defense's motion, citing the gravity of the charges and the potential risk of escape. Now she faced a long wait for trial in a pretrial detention cell. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to work. Prosecutors analyzed financial documents, criminologists searched for new evidence, and journalists monitored every stage of the trial. Melody Farris's name was constantly on the front pages of local newspapers, and more discussions appeared on social networks. This incident came as a real shock to Alpharetta. People couldn't believe that a woman who had lived side by side with a respected lawyer for decades could be charged with his murder. Public opinion was divided. Some believed in her guilt, while others believed that the case was based on guesswork and circumstantial evidence. Scott Ferris, their son, found himself in a situation that could hardly be called anything but a disaster. Until recently, he hoped that his father's death was a tragic accident, that the investigation had made a mistake, that the culprit had not yet been found. But the arrest of his mother destroyed all these illusions. He had to choose who to trust, the man who had been his pillar and example, or the woman who had given him life but was now facing murder charges. He avoided journalists, did not give interviews, and did not participate in public discussions. The only thing he said when reporters caught up with him outside the courthouse was a short statement. "I want the truth to come out." He wasn't defending his mother, but he wasn't accusing her either. Now everything depended on the court. Gary Ferris's death has already changed many people's lives, but his wife's arrest has raised even more questions. Her lawyers claimed that there was no direct evidence against her, that the investigation was based on the assumption that the weapon had not been found. However, the prosecution had no doubt that the evidence gathered was sufficient to bring the case to trial and secure a guilty verdict. But the most important question remained unanswered. If Melody had really committed murder, where was the gun? And if she didn't kill her husband, why did her behavior suggest otherwise? The investigation has not been completed yet, but it was nearing its denouement.
Melody Farris went before a judge today. She is charged with killing attorney Gary Ferris 1 year after his remains were found on the family's property.
November 2024. All eyes were on the courthouse, where one of the most high-profile trials in the history of Cherokee County unfolded. In a room crowded with journalists, members of the public, and neighbors of the Ferris family, the fate of the accused was being decided. This trial was not a simple case of a crime. It dealt with issues of trust in the justice system, fairness, and the limits of doubt. The prosecution insisted that there was enough evidence. The financial motive, the attempt to destroy evidence, and the contradictory testimony of the accused formed a convincing picture of her guilt. The defense argued that the evidence presented was circumstantial, and the lack of direct evidence made it impossible to establish with certainty that Melody had committed the murder. The trial turned into a battle of arguments, facts, and emotions. The prosecutors sought to restore justice, and the defense sought to protect the woman, whose guilt remained in question. The prosecutors, led by District Attorney Christopher Downey, presented a line of accusation based on 3 key aspects. Melody Farris was the sole beneficiary of her husband's $2 million insurance policy, and she could see in his death an opportunity to gain financial independence and a new life. The medical examiner's office determined that the fire started after Gary's death and did not cause his death. The fire was used to hide the traces of the crime. The bullet found in the victim's body was fired from a small caliber pistol, a weapon that is difficult to track. The very fact that there was no murder weapon implied that the perpetrator had deliberately disposed of the main evidence. Melody changed her testimony more than once. She could not explain exactly where she was on the day of the murder. Her answers about insurance were evasive, and her attempts to avoid discussing financial issues only increased suspicion. Neighbors testified to frequent arguments in the family related to money, and Gary's colleagues noted that in recent months he looked worried, although he never directly said that anything was bothering him. The defendant's lawyer, Richard Hollister, built a defense around insufficient evidence and the dubiousness of the charges. The defense emphasized that the evidence was circumstantial. There were no witnesses who saw Melody shoot her husband. The murder weapon was never found, and no fingerprints were found at the crime scene that would directly indicate her involvement. The defense cautiously hinted at the possibility of Gary's son, Scott Ferris, being involved, but did not make loud statements. The main argument was that the investigation focused on Melody too early, ignoring other versions. Also, according to the defense, the police jumped to conclusions. The officers, in their opinion, did not conduct a full analysis of all possible scenarios. Some of the neighbors' testimony, presented as key evidence, could be subjective interpretations of family quarrels. The main emphasis was on the fact that the accused was a mother and a widow who found herself at the center of the investigation, not because her guilt was proven, but because the police needed a convenient suspect. And after the speeches of the parties, when Melody Farris came to the podium, a tense silence reigned in the hall. She claimed that she was innocent, that she loved her husband and did not know who could have committed the crime. However, during cross-examination, her answers became uncertain. She was confused about the details and could not clearly explain why she lied about her location on the day of the murder. When the prosecutor presented documents confirming that 2 days after her husband's death, she signed an application for payment of the insurance amount, her voice trembled. These moments turned out to be critical, but it was her son who dealt the final blow. Scott Ferris, who had previously maintained neutrality, testified in support of the prosecution's version. He knew that his mother and father often clashed. He heard conversations about money. He saw changes in her behavior after Gary's death. His testimony was the moment when it became clear that the defense was losing ground. December 5th, 2024. Judge David L. Cannon Jr. read the verdict. There was a tense silence in the hall. Melody Farris was found guilty. Sentence: life imprisonment with the right to parole after 30 years, and an additional 5 years for concealing evidence and making false statements. When the judge announced the verdict, the accused showed no emotion. She didn't scream, she didn't beg for mercy. She just closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Scott, who was standing to the side, did not look at his mother. It was the hardest day of his life for him. When journalists tried to take a comment from him, he refused to answer questions. The only thing he said was, "I was hoping that the truth would be different." The story of Melody Farris has divided society into two camps. For some, her conviction was a long, awaited triumph of justice, punishment for the brutal crime that claimed the life of Gary Ferris. For others, it's a blatant example of a miscarriage of justice, where a woman whose guilt has never been proven unequivocally is behind bars. Melody's case raises questions that remain relevant not only for Cherokee County, but for the entire justice system. Is it possible to convict without admitting guilt, without direct evidence, only on the basis of circumstantial evidence and assumptions? Why did the investigation focus on only one version, ignoring other possible scenarios? Was this process objective, or was it a victim of hasty conclusions and pressure from public opinion? Now that the case is closed, there is only emptiness and doubt. Melody is serving her sentence, but her story continues to cause controversy and discussion. Some see her as a cold-blooded criminal, while others see her as a victim of the system. Whatever the truth, one thing remains unchanged. Gary Ferris's life ended tragically, and Melody's fate is forever linked to this crime. Their story has become a reminder that the truth sometimes remains elusive, and the lines between justice and error can be too thin to distinguish.